Good day, I'm Junior Researcher Adam Southgate, and today will be a summary of the events that transpired leading up to and during the Morganian Conclave campaign. I'd appreciate that all hunters please subscribe as to not miss any future announcements, and also if you enjoy the lectures and find them informative, please like the video and click the bell to ensure you do not miss any future videos. I would also be very happy to hear your thoughts, views, and stories of your own interactions with the monsters of the spheres in the comment area of this video. Also, I'm always ready to answer any questions you may have, and please share these lectures with any hunters you feel would benefit from them. So, this will be a reading of each of the collective reports that made up the Morganian Conclave campaign. We begin with the announcement of the contract. Well, hunters, the time has finally come. The High Druid has given the order, and we are to retake Anglesey from the Morganian Conclave. Firstly, this will be a secret war. We do not wish to expose ourselves or the Conclave to the general public due to the possible belief effect upon the spheres. In aid of this, all operations that involve direct combat must be undertaken at night. Along with this, the general public has been informed that military wargames will be taking place around Anglesey as extra cover and as an excuse for the weapons fire. The order has pinpointed 3 possible breaching points to begin our assault. The first is the most direct, crossing the bridge into Llangfwyr. This option gives the easiest direct crossing, however we know that the Conclave are watching the bridges, which means there will be a high chance that the invasion will be detected. The second will be via dinghy from Llanelli to Merlin, then pushing up to the village of Llandwen. This option gives us access to a base of operations within Anglesey, as the town does contain an Order safe house. However, it will mean sending in a smaller team to begin with, as hundreds of hunters making the crossing will arouse suspicion. The final option will be to take smaller boats to a commandeered ferry from Dinistynol, then riding the ferry to Holyhead's new harbour. This approach offers the option of arriving as tourists to hopefully not arouse suspicion, however, if caught out, does leave you at a disadvantage due to your weapons being stowed away. This choice is vital as it's deciding upon a landing site which will dictate the entire rest of the campaign. The hunters decided upon taking the dinghy with a smaller team to take the town of Llandwen. A smaller select group of hunters boarded the dinghy at 2 AM Greenwich Mean Time and crossed over from Llanelli to Merlin. Hunter Dan Carrington, though having pushed for the ferry approach to Holyhead, joined the team across the dividing river with the other hunters. Hunter Gasmaskman I-70, having retrieved the lost blade Calabolg, managed to return just in time to also make the crossing. Upon the opposite bank, the team of hunters slowly made their approach to the village of Llandwen. The team observed the town for 2 hours, noting that the Conclave had only left a smaller force of their own mundane hunters to defend the village. During the observations, Dan Carrington reported over radio that the Conclave members were brazenly bearing arms. This is worrying as it implies a breach of the secrecy compact, which even the Conclave typically subscribe to. The hunters split into 2 separate teams, one led by Hunter Gasmaskman I-70, the other by Hunter Dan Carrington. Each team entered the village from opposite sides at 5 AM. The battle was brief, though as Hunter Gasmaskman I-70 later reported, the Conclave members within the village seemed inexperienced and barely empowered by Celtic knots. With the village secured and the safe house converted into a field base, the hunters needed to decide what the next step of the operation should be. The bulk of our forces were still on the mainland, and it was unknown whether or not the Conclave were aware of our presence within Anglesey. The first plan was a pincer assault upon Llangfwyr, with the main force attacking across the bridge while the infiltration team attacked from the rear. We knew that the town had a much higher conclave presence, with at least 2 active Fae in play within the town. We also observed via long-range surveillance that the civilian population had been gathered around a large tree that did not exist before the conclave invasion. The second plan involved the infiltration team pushing to Maltrath, a small village on the Avon Kevney. If taken, it would have given us a new landing site for the main force. Our last report given to us by gamekeeper Charlie James before his disappearance was that a strange cult dedicated to an unknown Fae had taken over the town, converting the populace. His final words were, "They give themselves to the thistle." Finally, the third plan required the infiltration team to make their way to a beach by Newborough National Nature Reserve and Forest. Once there, the team could have used flares to guide the boats in under the cover of night. However, we did have some reservations as we had no sighting of conclave activity at the location. While this may appear to be as a good thing at first glance, we must remember that we are dealing with a faction with access to Fae magics. The truth is that we had no idea what the team might need to deal with within the area. Both under Hunter Gasmasman I-70's advisement and the reports given by Hunter Dan Carrington's team, the infiltration team opted for Plan 2 and split into 2 separate forces, the smaller team led by Hunter Gasmasman I-70 remaining within Llandwen to hold the forward operating base now set up within the town. The larger force, led by Hunter Dan Carrington, crossed the countryside to reach the town of Maltrath, to capture it as a place for the main force to land. Dan Carrington reported some rather distressing sights as his team made their way across the countryside. The burnt remains of large wooden effigies with the scent of burnt flesh on the wind. A small woodland not recorded on any map that after a short observation turned out to be people only partially transmuted into trees which softly sobbed in agony. According to our experts in the Fae sphere, these were all the remains of failed rituals. What was more worrying was the complete lack of subtlety the Conclave were displaying. While never as covert as ourselves, the Conclave have always attempted in the past to maintain the veil of secrecy. However, during this event, they simply did not seem to care in the slightest. Once Hunter Dan Carrington's team began approaching the village of Maltrath, they reported in again, however this time more urgently. The members of the town that were still standing appeared to be conducting some kind of Fae ritual of their own, and they were nearing completion. The majority of the people within the town had already been crushed into a facsimile of a dragon. The creature was lifeless, a mass of human limbs and loose skin. However, if they were able to finish, we believe that they could have created something very similar to a dragon. They had to be stopped, however the infiltration team was limited in number. The question was to either go in now and risk failure or to wait for the arrival of the main force via boat and risk the cultists finishing the ritual. Worried about the possibility of the Conclave possessing their own dragon, even one made of human flesh, the infiltration team moved in. As they drew closer, they witnessed the terrible ritual that was taking place in all its detail. They reported back the sight of both Conclave members and townsfolk, either charmed or hexed, all participating in the morbid festivities, with each present having a single thistle growing out of the main artery upon their neck. While the group chanted in an ancient dialect of Welsh, at random intervals one of the revelers would throw themselves onto the pile of bodies, making up the rough form of a dragon. Once in contact with the putrid effigy, the limbs of those already within would reach out and pull the newcomer into the mound as their flesh fused and knitted together. While other hunters were still working to get into position, a young journeyman panicked, firing into the crowd, thinking that one of the cultists had seen him. The other cultists, startled by the sound, began throwing themselves into the pile, all sense of ceremony lost. The other hunters, put into a difficult position, opened fire, taking down cultists before they could join their fellows. Once the dust had settled, a great many cultists lay dead or dying, with those still clinging to life trying to pull their riddled bodies to the malformed beast, but to no avail. While the hunters were securing the area, the sickly broken worm began to breathe. Before anyone could react, it let out a breath of foul smoke that caused the skin of 2 hunters caught in the attack to slough from their bodies, while they screamed until death took them. The hunters, reacting quickly, unloaded their weapons into the assault against life itself, ending it. What hit all there at the time was the pure distraction such a beast could have caused if allowed to fully gestate. Hours later, the main force arrived in Maltrath via boats, and the now much larger group of hunters headed back to Llandwen, the Order's staging post within Anglesey. The question was, how should the assault proceed? Intelligence at the time had shown that Anthra the She had been captured by the Conclave, though not yet removed from Anglesey. While the Order did not and does not have any trust in the Fae, we could not risk the Conclave gaining access to his abilities, and on a personal note, his aid during the defense of Dry Goch and the slaying of the Titan was instrumental, so on some level we did owe him. We knew that the Conclave had made their initial landfall at Amlech, and were still using the town as their main point of ingress and egress from Wales. If we could capture the town of Amlech, we could cut off those of the Conclave upon Anglesey from Avalon. Therefore, we were presented with 3 possible options. The first was to take the longest route following the coast anti-clockwise. While this would by far take the longest, it would maintain our ability to remain covert. The second was by road directly to the town of Amlech, which would be the quickest, however this would most likely remove any chance of remaining covert, as the most direct path led through several towns and villages. Finally, there was the middle path, a hike across the countryside avoiding any populated areas. This was the best of both, but also the worst, and it would have left the hunters very exposed if spotted while en route. The plan was decided to race to Amlech, then splitting into 2 separate forces to attack the coastal town from 2 sides, the hunters all together loaded up with a motley collection of vehicles taken from the town of Llandwen. The sights the hunters were confronted with on their way were, while yes disturbing, all spoke of desperate failed rituals, however, to what end no one could say. The small villages the hunters passed through were either abandoned or filled with fey-twisted monstrosities, some too malformed to even lift their heads to watch the hunters pass. The biggest block in the way of the hunters' progress was the large town of Llangefni. From long-range observations, it had been hastily garrisoned by the Conclave. Many of the buildings within the town were covered in a twisted fusion of flesh and tree root, most likely the remnants of the occupants. However, the purposes of the growths were unknown. The hunters needed to reach the opposite side of the town to access the B5111 road, which would allow them to get back on the move towards Amlech. Some hunters suggested falling back to the A55 road and heading west and continuing north, however others argued that by all likelihood they would run into similar roadblocks elsewhere, and so it would have been better to break through there and then. Hunter Dan Carrington and his Canadian squad, the Cold Iron Rangers, originally in Wales for training related to the Fey Sphere, charged forward, smashing into and through the Conclave barricade before anyone else could react. Under extremely heavy fire, the Canadians forced their way through the town and to the other side. During their rapid assault, the Conclave reacted too slowly to stop them, but quickly enough to close a path for the other hunters. The team had become split in two. The Welsh hunters were left to play catch-up under heavy fire from the now fully alerted Conclave members. The fighting was brutal and devolved into a building-by-building slog. The gunfire was coming from every window, making it impossible to simply drive through. Along with this, with the town empty of civilians, them being rendered down into the tendrils that covered the buildings, the Conclave unleashed their fey magics against the hunters. Those younger hunters, or those who were simply too slow, were either twisted into unrecognizable forms or simply riddled by arms fire, the tendrils quickly wrapping around the dead, dissolving them into more of itself. The battle took hours, with a good deal of hunters lost. However, the Conclave within the town were defeated, but the hunters were either exhausted, wounded, or both. Once the dust had settled, it was clear that the Canadian force was nowhere to be seen, with many hunters commenting that now they understood why they were the reason for the Geneva Convention. The hunters remaining were stuck. With so many exhausted men, what they really needed was rest. However, if they did not push through, the hostages, Anthra, and the Canadians may have been lost. Despite the danger, the Welsh hunters decided to follow the Canadian team's lead, either out of concern for their safety or from being inspired by their suicidal levels of courage. Those still capable of standing unassisted, not counting Pinocchio frames, loaded up to chase after Hunter Dan Carrington's team, with Hunter Gasmaskman I-70 taking command. The sword he'd recently retrieved from his own expedition, Calabolg, now unsheathed and held proudly in his hand. The hunters raced up the B5111 road while fending off aerial assaults by limb-distorted fey-touched birds, but together they managed to hold back the relentless waves. Beyond the feathered hordes, the hunters witnessed an increase in the madness brought by the Conclave, all thought of the secrecy compact seemingly forgotten. Fields filled with eyeless people dancing around blood-soaked trees for so long that the skin had worn away from their feet. Hills covered with heads staked upon wooden poles, each of which somehow letting out a piercing scream. All these acts reeked of a kind of insane desperation, of countless failed rituals. 2 hours later, and the hunters arrived outside Amlech. Before anyone could see what was transpiring, they heard the sound of fitful gunfire coming from the port of the town. Hunter Gasmaskman I-70 took a small squad, repositioning to attempt to gain a better view before the Conclave would notice them. The Canadian team had driven straight through the town at seemingly full speed to the dock and set up a firing position there. While only half the members of Hunter Dan Carrington's team remained, they had effectively stopped the Conclave from transporting anyone else to Avalon. Looking over the situation, one thing stuck out to the hunters above everything else. The Conclave seemed to have been evacuating and not bringing in more people. A short distance from the dock, they saw a collection of civilians bound and guarded by Conclave hunters, seemingly people they wanted to steal away to Avalon. However, a building on the opposite side of town was even more heavily guarded. Hunter Gasmaskman I-70, after looking at the defenses, theorized that this was most likely where Anthra was being held. 3 options were open to the hunters. Firstly, to reinforce the Canadians to ensure the Conclave could not escape. Secondly, was to use the distraction created by the Canadians to attempt to save the civilians, who may be killed once the Conclave realize that there is no escape. Thirdly, to use the distraction created by the Canadians to attempt to save Anthra. While he was not technically on our side, his goals did align with our own, and if he was taken to a Fey Morgana, he would have been turned into something far less hospitable to us. Their path decided and led by Hunter Gasmaskman I-70, the Welsh hunters pushed towards the heavily defended building that they believed Anthra to be held within. The push through the town was like walking through a spinning fan. So many rounds were fired at the hunters that it was only luck if they did not take at least one hit. Leading from the front of his team and wielding Calabolg, Hunter Gasmaskman I-70 moved with an unnatural speed and precision, slicing through fey-twisted monstrosities as if he was simply cutting the air. One hunter later swore that he saw Gasmaskman I-70 deflect a round from a high-powered rifle with the sword. Meanwhile, the Canadian team, led by Hunter Dan Carrington, fought valiantly to hold the port as bullets flew around them and fey magics crept between their feet. One of the older hunters spread cold iron filings across the ground to keep the magics at bay, while Dan fired shot after shot at Conclave members, each round hitting their mark. The problem was that with every 10 Conclave members the Canadians took down, one of theirs would fall, never to rise again. Reaching the building where Anthra was held, the Welsh hunters were bathed in rifle fire. The sounds of ricochets as metal met paving stone was deafening. Thankfully, the Conclave had not expected the hunters so soon, so the door to the building was still very much open. Hunter Gasmaskman I-70 ordered the majority of his hunters to maintain fire at the building's windows. He then took a smaller squad and rushed through under the cover of the suppressive fire. Hunter Dan Carrington wanted to warn the Welsh hunters about a threat he had seen earlier, but the radio he had become too badly damaged, now peppered with holes. 5 hunters, 4 hunters, 3 hunters. They were dropping too fast. 2 hunters, 1 hunter. Dan, the last able to fight, in a low tone, muttered, "Push on, brave York volunteers," the final words of Sir Isaac Brock, and then he continued to hold his position. Thankfully for the Welsh hunters, the majority of the building's defenders were, at the time, still frantically trying to stop others from gaining access. Hunter Gasmaskman I-70, filled with an almost unnatural rage, cut through Conclave members within the building with a pure ferocity. No matter how many rounds were fired at him, none seemed willing to hit their mark. All seemed to pass just where he was instead of where he was currently standing. Hunter Dan Carrington had slumped against the side of a van he was using as cover. Every other vehicle was, at this point, a burning wreck. He'd counted 2, or was it 3 bullets inside him? He couldn't be sure. The only upside was that the Conclave had become so afraid of him that they hadn't dared approach his position. In his after-action report, he wrote that he thought that he might make it through, but he'd have to be very lucky. Once the building was secure, the complete opposite situation had begun occurring, with the Welsh hunters firing out the windows to keep the Conclave back. Hunter Gasmaskman I-70 searched frantically for Anthra. On the top floor, behind a locked door, he found him, seemingly stuck within the form of a fawn. His flesh had greyed, becoming sunken and as thin as paper. His hair, usually a vibrant collection of deep green leaves, had shriveled and browned. He was dying. Anthra, as a being, is fueled by packs, and since his alliance with the Order, it seemed that he had kept his word and not created any new ones. The hunters had to decide. They could attempt to empower Anthra by making pacts with him, but he may have been too far gone. He could have been saved with Calabolg, but destroying it in the process, but only Hunter Gasmaskman I-70 could have ever made that decision. And some hunters argued that the creature was a fey and not worth their pity. 8 hunters stepped forward, the most battered of the masters. Young hunters protested, exclaiming that the being was a fey, and even so, 8 lives for one was madness. One of the 8 shook his head, saying, "You kids don't get it yet, but you will, if you live long enough." Each, one by one, made the same pact with Anthra. "My life for yours, and each slumped to the floor, their terminal breath flowing through the air to fill Anthra's lungs. With each of the 8 inhales, Anthra's skin regained its color, the leaves that made up his hair regained their piercing green. He stood, though uncertainly. He was alive, but something had changed. With the lives of the 8, he had become something approaching human. The sword of Calabolg, he explained, would have returned him to what he was, but now he's not sure what he is. The magic of the Fae still runs through him, but the world has less colors. Having worked frantically to stabilize his apprentice, Hunter Dan Carrington used what was left upon himself. He was pretty sure he'd live, but moving more than his head was a trial in itself. He knew it would only be a matter of time before the conclave came for him, and his pistol only had 3 rounds left. He did what he could to ready himself and waited for the approaching footsteps. The sound that came was far closer to thunder than any mortal man's steps could be. An avatar of Ife Morgana, birthed from the sacrifice of a true Fae, exploded to life within the town of Amlech. The sound was deafening, but the voice that followed reached deep into the minds of all that witnessed, like mold spreading across a corpse. Words like twisting fingers grasped the minds of the hunters, commanding them to kneel. Only 2 were unaffected, the bearer of Calabolg, Hunter Gasmaskman I-70, and Anthra, who was surprised that he didn't feel the need to obey. Though there was no love lost between the 2, both headed out of the building to confront the Avatar, a puppet of Ife Morgana that, although a pale reflection, still possessed great power. Anthra, weakened by his ordeal, could not summon his magic, and so picked up a rifle of a hunter who was still locked onto his knees. Looking at the weapon, he casually said to himself, "So uncivilized," a self-satisfied grin on his face. The battle was thankfully brief. Anthra, using the rifle, drew the being that imitated his mother's attention, while Gasmaskman I-70 drew close with Calabolg to strike at the being. The scream that was released on the sword's contact with the Avatar was scarring to all that heard it, a twisted mix of rage, anguish, and terror. The being seemed drawn into the blade. It fought with all its very being, but nothing it did could change its fate, and it vanished into the ancient steel. Hours later, and the town was under the control of the Order completely. The Conclave members still remaining had either been captured or had fled into the countryside. They would need to be hunted down along with the Fae-twisted creatures, but for now, today was a victory. Hunter Dan Carrington and his apprentice survived, but needed a great deal of medical care and had to be airlifted to an emergency Order-ran hospital. Anthra, though alive, was shaken by what had transpired and what he now was. Time, he proclaimed, is what he needed. Hunter Gasmaskman I-70's hand still felt the vibration of the blade as the Avatar entered it and was sealed away. Such a powerful thing, he was overheard saying to himself. But one question still remained unsolved. The countless failed rituals, the desperation to take people and Anthra back to Avalon, and the fact that the Conclave weren't unloading new Conclave members. They were attempting to flee from Anglesey. Looking over the port, they had started their retreat days before the Hunters' assault on Anglesey had even begun. So, what were they running from? I want to say thank you to all the hunters that made decisions that made this contract a success. I also want to give a special thank you to Hunter Dan Carrington, Hunter Gasmaskman I-70, and Anthra the She. But with Arthur's might and Merlin's wisdom, have a good night, hunters.